Now to round out our overview of 3D, we're going to be looking at cameras. Cameras in After Effects work in a surprisingly similar way to how cameras actually work in real life. We have the same sort of concepts like focal length, aperture, iris shape, among other things, and these are all adjustable and keyframeable. Let's take a look at how we can incorporate cameras into our project. Here I have a composition with 3 anglerfish. You can see that each one is represented on my composition. I've already made these elements 3D elements. We'll go ahead and switch to our 2 views. Currently, all of the fish are located in the same Z location. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the position property for all 3 layers, and we're going to make adjustments to their Z position. So anglerfish 3, which is the purple fish, is going to come forward in space a little bit. In addition to moving the fish forward, I'm also going to adjust the X position and move the fish a little bit over to the left. For angler 2, which is the fish on the left, I'm going to once again adjust the Z position, and I'll bring this fish closer to us in space. Just like before, I'm also going to adjust the X position so that the fish is still within the frame. If we look at the top view and zoom out a little bit, you can see that here is the fish on the right, the purple fish, here's the fish on the left, and then my original fish, the one in the middle, is back at the default plane of my background. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new camera. Whenever you work in 3D, After Effects is using the default active camera. But in addition to utilizing this camera, we can create our own camera and modify all sorts of different properties about it. In order to create a new camera, you'll come to Layer, New, Camera. Once you choose this option, the Camera Settings dialog box is going to open. You'll be able to choose from a number of different settings, but even if you don't pick the right settings here, it's not a problem because you'll be able to adjust these things later once the element has been added into your project. The first thing that I want to point out is we have different types of cameras. We have a 1-node camera and a 2-node camera. Right now we're going to be focusing on the 1-node camera. These cameras are easy to understand, they're easy to use, and they work well with the camera tools. They're a little bit more lifelike. The downside of using these cameras is there's no point of interest and there's no ability to orbit. So we will compare both of these as we go through this section of the course. So as I mentioned, the 1-node camera operates in a very similar way to a real-life camera. You are able to adjust things like the pan, tilt, zoom, and the focal distance. In addition to setting what type of camera, you can also adjust things like the film size, the focal length, the angle of view, the zoom setting, and we have the option to enable depth of field and to lock a zoom. When we look at this little diagram representation, you'll see that a diagram is showing us where our camera is focusing on. This right here is your composition. This is the default location. This dotted line is the focal length. So this is where the camera is focusing on. If you have an element here or here, those elements could appear more blurry if you enable depth of field. And it's going to be a little bit easier for me just to show you this. So I'm just going to use these default settings and I'll go ahead and click OK. Once we create a camera, you can see we have a new element in our timeline called Camera 1. If we look at our top view, you can see that now I have a camera and I have this cone that's pointing at my composition. That is representing the angle of view. The angle of view is exactly what the name is implying. A wide angle is going to allow you to see a wider view of your composition. As you make changes to the various settings, the composition view is going to change. I'm going to ensure that the view on the left is my active camera, Camera 1. And if we come to the pull-down menu right here, you can see how we can choose Camera 1, which currently is the active camera, so those are the same. Default if we go back to that, that's just the default view that After Effects provides, but we want to be using our active camera 1 that we just created. And I'll leave my top view so that we can have a better idea of where our elements are and what's happening with the camera. If we go into the camera in the timeline and we go to the camera options, all of those settings that we were looking at when we first made the camera are available. The zoom is pretty much another way of saying focal length. If we adjust the zoom, the angle of the view and the focal length are going to change. And you can see as I increase this value, I'm zooming in on my composition. Notice what's happening in my active camera view. And if I drag to the left and reduce this number, I'm zooming out. So here I'm getting a wider view. And if you check the top view on the right, you can see as I make these changes, the camera cone of interest is also changing. The depth of field is a setting that you need to turn on or off. And the depth of field is an optical effect that blurs out the foreground and the background. And it's really an awesome feature if you want your projects to look really lifelike. So let's go ahead and turn this on. Now that this is on, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make adjustments to the focal distance. Currently, if we select our camera is focusing in on the main area of our composition. If we change our focal distance, and you can see as I make changes to the focal distance, that lighter kind of peach line is changing. So if we pull the focal distance back, so it's closer to our camera, and then if we adjust our aperture, and the aperture is similar to a real-life camera's aperture, it's going to adjust how shallow the depth of field is. The larger the aperture, the more shallow the in-focused area will be. So you can see as I increase this value, how my two fish that are farther away from our focal distance now become much more blurred. So this line right here is the fish on the left, and my focus distance is right in front of that. So as I make changes to the aperture, that is the element that's going to stay more in focus. If we adjust this value and bring it down, so we have a lower aperture, then that blurring is not going to be as distinct. So if I make this 0, everything is in the same amount of sharpness. But if we increase this value, you can see how the element that is the most far away gets really blurry. The element that is kind of like mid distance is somewhat blurry, and then the element that is really close to our focal distance is going to be super sharp. So if we now go back and adjust the focal distance, if I pull this forward and focus on the fish on the right, now it becomes sharp and clear, and my other two fish are more blurred depending on how far away they are. If we go ahead and change this value and bring it all the way to the fish in the middle, you can see how the other two fish become blurred, and this one is our clear fish. In addition to being able to control how much the blur is, we also have a blur level. And the blur level is going to control the blurring amount. So even though we've adjusted the aperture, if my blur level is set to 0, then we don't have any blur. So this is going to adjust how much blur is being applied to our out of focus areas. And you can see if we increase this, we can really go kind of crazy with it and give it a very blurred type of look. So you'll need to experiment around with these settings to see which values are going to work best for your project. The iris shape is a way that we can control the shape of our lens. So this would be the actual shape of the iris. And when you change to different settings, you'll get slightly different results. So you can see as I make changes to these, some of my elements on my screen are going to become less blurred or more blurred. It just is going to kind of be based on personal preference and what you think is going to work well for your particular project. I'm just going to leave this at a hexagon type of shape for right now. You can also rotate the iris. That's probably not going to really do much for us because we're using hexagon, but if we're using like triangular or square, we would see more of a difference. We can control the roundness of the iris, so that's something that you can adjust as well. And then we just have different sorts of settings in here, and if you're familiar with cameras and film, these might feel a little bit more comfortable for you. If you're just trying to be able to control the camera, I would say that these first several options are going to be things that you're going to be adjusting more often than not. You don't even have to work with these other settings if you don't want to, but they are available to you. If we move our camera, so if I go ahead and select my camera, you can see that I am changing the distance of the camera from the elements. And because my focal distance is now not focused on anything, if we move our camera, we could be inadvertently creating blurriness on things that we might not want to. But we can move the camera in a number of directions. If I was to pan my camera in the X direction back and forth, you can see I'm moving it on a more horizontal plane. Obviously, we can go into the transform controls and control any of these. So Y is going to move this up or down. And then obviously Z is going to control how far or close the camera is. In addition to being able to make these adjustments in our active camera view, we can always switch to one of our custom views. And let me just zoom in a little bit more here. If we go ahead and select our camera, here's our 3 fish. And as we move the camera, we're going to be moving what the camera is kind of focusing on in our particular view. So this might give you a little bit better of an idea. But working with this one node camera is simply going to allow us to make these alterations to our camera and be able to adjust any of the position settings, and it will update and change the rendered view of our project. I'm going to switch back to the top view, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse camera 1, which is our one node camera. We're just going to hide this from view, and you can see that my active camera now switches to the default camera. This is After Effects default camera. We're going to make another new camera, and this time we're going to use all of the default settings, but we're going to make a 2-node camera. So I'm going to choose 2-node camera. Everything else we're going to leave as is. We'll click OK. And by default, it looks kind of similar. We don't really see a huge difference, but the biggest difference is going to be this line that goes through the center. This is our point of interest. And what we can do is we can grab the point of interest and move where the camera is looking. Not only can we control the position of the camera itself, we can also control what the camera is focusing on. And we can move this point of interest node about. This 2-node camera is simply a camera with a point of interest. This is unlike a camera in real life, because with the 2-node camera, you can revolve around a single point in 3D space. If I select my camera and we go ahead and we go to our transform and I rotate the camera, you can see that I'm rotating my camera, but my point of interest is moving, right? It's moving this line. However, if we go ahead and use the point of interest and we move the point of interest, now the camera stays stationary, but I'm panning my camera about and focusing on where I'm looking within my scene on a new area. Let's pair this with our camera options, and let's go ahead and turn on our depth of field, similar to what we did before. We're going to go ahead and we're going to adjust our focal distance. So I'll kind of lock that in on the fish over here on the right. And then let's go ahead and let's make adjustments to our aperture. So we'll up the aperture. And as we do that, you can see the same sort of thing happens where this fish on the right is nice and sharp and these other two fish are somewhat blurry. But if I grab my point of interest and change where it's looking, I still haven't changed my aperture or my focal distance, but I can come in and I can change where we're panning about in the scene. And clearly you could animate or change all of these things over time. The two-node camera really makes complex movements like orbits and arcs and things that you typically could not do in real life, but using After Effects you can achieve these movements that really wouldn't be possible in some sort of real life. So you can really do some kind of cool, trickier movement when you use the two-node type of camera. As you can see, both of these cameras have a lot of the same settings, but the important distinction is the fact that with the two-node camera, we have the addition of this point of interest. So we can really control exactly where the camera is looking within our scene and focus what we want to dial in on. And as we make changes to the various settings, you can see how the scene itself is going to be affected if you have the depth of field on, where you're going to achieve the types of results where some of the scene might get more blurred out if it's off in the distance or too close to us, depending on the actual focal distance and what it is that we're concentrating on when we rotate and move about our scene. And the final thing I want to mention about cameras is we had talked about some of these tools right here, which allow us to move around in 3D space. All of the tools have something that you can do that's related to the camera. So here I have orbit around camera POI, which stands for point of interest. And if I select that tool and we move this, you can see how I'm moving in 3D space, but I'm not actually moving the fish. I'm clicked on my scene. You'll notice how my camera is spinning around in 3D space. So this allows you to create some really sophisticated types of animations. And if we're using our two-node camera, you can see how the point of interest of my camera stays focused at the same exact point. And as I orbit around the point of interest, everything is switching, but the camera itself is still focused on that one exact point. If we hide our two-node camera and go back to our one-node camera and use the same sort of tool, I can pan my camera, but you can see I quickly lose the scene, and that's because I'm not rotating around that particular point of interest anymore. I don't have a point of interest, so I am able to swing my camera around, but I, at some point, get off of my composition and I just don't see anything that's happening. And remember, if stuff gets all crazy and you've lost what you're looking at, you can always go up to Layer, Camera, and you can reset your camera. So if I just go ahead and reset my camera, it resets it back to its default view before we started orbiting around. In addition to orbiting around our scene, we can also pan our camera around the point of interest. And again, these types of choices are going to work much better on a two-node camera. So let's switch back to our two-node camera. When I switched to my two-node camera, because I had been panning with the orbit tool, I have this weird 3D view, but I can always go to Layer, Camera, and I can simply reset camera 2, and that just resets it. And right now I have the pan camera point of interest, and if we go ahead and make changes, you can see how I'm just simply panning the camera, and I can pan it up or down, but I'm really panning the point of interest is what's happening. I'm moving that point of interest around. And then finally we have the dolly, and we can dolly to the camera point of interest as well. So this just allows us to zoom in and zoom out. And as I do zoom my camera in and out, you can see how my point of interest stays fixed. It does not move the point of interest. We're moving around that point of interest point, but we're not actually moving the point of interest itself. So you can really achieve some pretty cool types of results by utilizing these tools and just going in and experimenting around with the different options that we have in regards to the various types of cameras.